May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, our Lord and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, today we enter the long liturgical season of Ordinary Time. Traditionally, Ordinary Time is when we digest the message of the gospel we've learned between Advent and Pentecost, and we apply it to our ordinary lives. This seems especially important during Ordinary Time in 2020, which is anything but ordinary. It feels pretty extraordinary to me. For one thing, here we are 3/4 of the way through June, and we remain worshiping online after about 14 weeks, and we will continue to worship online until further notice. It's not safe or practical for us to move back into the church right now. Of course, we will continue to discuss this as the health situation unfolds. 2, we are also beginning the next phase of our interim time with the calling of our search committee. And 3, we are living in a historic era of social change in our society. This is no ordinary time. But it's not the first time that All Saints has faced big challenges and big social change. Last Sunday at our Zoom coffee hour, Margaret Hamilton said, "Can you believe today is the 30th anniversary of Doug Jackson's death?" I want to take a few moments this morning to celebrate Doug Jackson, because here on this secular holiday of Father's Day, I think Doug Jackson fits the description of being a father of the church. I never met Doug, but it turns out we were born about the same time. But now I am 62, and Doug died at 34. What I know about him comes from reading Larry Holman's History of All Saints and conversations with many of you since I've been here. Doug grew up in the South and came to San Francisco as a young man in 1980. He was raised Presbyterian, but when he found All Saints, he became Episcopalian. And he dove into ministry here at All Saints. He supported the HACS program and worked with the Mayor's Office of Homelessness to organize shelters for women and children in churches around the city during the winter months. Homelessness has been around a long time. There was also a men's shelter at All Saints in those days, and Doug was actively involved with that. Doug is remembered as a kind and loving man, and, as I've heard, a good-looking one too. He was blessed with a deep faith, and he shared God's love generously with All Saints and with the larger community. Doug died at 34, one of the many young gay men claimed by the AIDS virus in San Francisco. I wish I'd known him. I wish he were still here with us. He is missed. I think that one of All Saints' challenges over the years has been recovering from the devastation of the AIDS crisis. The last 30 years have been full and rewarding, yet I think there's been a lingering sadness. So many lives were tragically cut short. Young fathers of the church, like Doug, who were in their 30s then, would now be in their 60s, still vital, still actively supporting All Saints through their time, talent, and treasure. It is June, and June is Pride Month. So much has changed in these last 30 years. AIDS is now mostly a chronic disease in the United States. Same-sex marriage is the law of the land. And this week, the Supreme Court upheld the rights of LGBTQ people in the workplace. These are changes to celebrate. I think it's worth remembering that the status of today's LGBTQ community required struggle. In 1966, there was a riot at the Compton cafeteria in downtown San Francisco when the trans and gay patrons of that coffee shop refused to be arrested. And in New York City, there was the famous Stonewall Uprising. Progress on AIDS treatment required protests. A lesbian couple from the East Bay went all the way to the Supreme Court and won the right to marry. My daughter and her wife were married in 2016, and they used a passage from the Supreme Court decision in their wedding ceremony. Positive change requires struggle. In our gospel passage from Matthew today, we hear Jesus telling his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Perhaps the sword that Jesus is talking about is the sword of truth. For many LGBTQ young people, coming out meant losing their former safe life, but they gained the freedom of living their truth. It took truth-telling to bring the community to where it is today, and All Saints was part of that. It is something we can celebrate in our search for a new priest. Another thing we can celebrate during our search is our historic role as a racially integrated church when integration was barely a term. Last fall, when we gathered to talk about our history, we saw photos of the 1964 church directory. There were people of every ethnic group here at All Saints, including many Black families. The rector, Father Harris, welcomed everyone in the neighborhood under the big tent of Anglo-Catholic worship, and many of those Black members became lay leaders who stood by the parish into the mid-70s, which was a difficult era for All Saints. I think this relates to the great struggle against racism happening in these extraordinary times right now, led by the Black Lives Matter movement. Unfortunately, the roots of racism go deep. Today, in our reading from Genesis, we hear the story of Hagar, who bore a son, Ishmael, with Abraham. Abraham's wife, Sarah, casts Hagar out of the household when she sees Hagar's son, Ishmael, playing with her son, Isaac. Maybe it was because of jealousy, and quite possibly it was because Hagar was a Black Egyptian. It's a heartbreaking story. Hagar walks out into the wilderness with her baby and waits for them both to die. The good news is God hears their cries and sends an angel who says, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And tradition says that Ishmael grows up to be the father of the Arab people. What troubles you, Hagar? I think we know what troubles Black Americans. For too long, they have been oppressed, often violently, because their flourishing has threatened white America, just as Hagar was threatening to Sarah. The good news is that God is on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor. That is the God we see in the face of Jesus, who died a brutal death on the cross and was raised on the third day for us, for all of us. In our beautiful passage from Romans today, we heard, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. Racism and white supremacy is the opposite of the gospel. Christ came to reconcile the whole world to God. Christ commands us to love each other as Christ loved us. In our baptismal vows, we promise to uphold the dignity of every human being, which means that Black Lives Matter to the church. We celebrate the advancement of human freedom. We celebrate the joy of Juneteenth. I think the good news is that there is positive change happening because more and more white Americans are having their eyes opened to the reality in front of them, and some sort of transformation of the heart is underway. I am on the board of the Episcopal Impact Fund, and our chairperson sent out an email today endorsing the work of Black Lives Matter. The email included a quote from PolicyLink's Angela Glover Blackwell, who said, "This moment," quote, "feels like a seismic shift and the beginning of America's next story." The beginning of America's next story. She encourages us to do the work, and it will be different this time. The email to the board contained an excellent list of resources for us white members on the board to do the work of educating ourselves about Black history and the reality of racism in our country. And I can share it with the parish, and I'd like to explore it with you in the coming days. This is the first Sunday in ordinary time, but these times are extraordinary, and I think they are extraordinarily rich for a church like ours entering a search for a new priest. How do we apply the lessons we have learned from our history and from our faith in these extraordinary times? How do we move forward the legacy of All Saints' ministry and witness in the extraordinary times to come? Amen.